Well, hello again, and welcome to our next episode of the Dock Talk. Thank you again for joining me, Captain Monroe. Always a pleasure to see you.
Well, it's always a joy to see you as well, Aimee, and we're very pleased to have Captain Mike Davie with us today, who is the Vice President of Business Development and Technology for the Halifax Port Authority. And he's down here for our annual joint board meeting and stuff like that. So it's a pleasure to have you. And I just want to point out that we arranged to have sunshine today for a change, considering that it seemed like Atlantic Canada here in May for about the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful.
Welcome.
Yeah,
You're our
happy to be
first
here.
guest, ever on the Dock Talk podcast. So welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about the Port of Halifax and what you're all doing up there.
So the Port of Halifax is one of 17 Canadian port authorities that are managed under the Canada Marine Act. So there are focused ports as far as the supply chain goes. Halifax is the biggest port on the East Coast as far as the harbor goes, and the port areas. But we're not the biggest port as far as volume goes. I think that's still Montreal in the St. Lawrence River. But Halifax has been focused primarily on trying to grow what we call the Atlantic Gateway. We currently have over 600,000 TU that come through on the container side. We've got 5 billion tons of general cargo that come through the port. And of course, we have cruise ships. So we have up to 200 cruise ships a year, almost 350,000 people this year. So that's turned around quite quickly after COVID. But that's what we're focused on. We're focused on growing the port to get over 1 million containers through the port and the gateway into Central North America, as well as the cruise business. And we're trying to do that in the next sort of 20 to 30 years.
It's unique. It's a very deep port navigationally and everything. And it's where the convoys would be assembled from, Portland, Maine being one place, and the convoys up in Halifax. And of course, you've got 2 facilities up there. You have the South facility, and then you have the one in Bedford Basin. And they're now both operated by the Singapore Port Authority.
That's right. Yeah. So PSA International took those 2 container terminals over 2 years ago. And now we have one terminal operator, which is an advantage, connected by an 8-kilometer stretch of rail line. So we have a number of projects to try to take trucks off the downtown core of the city, and we're working on one now that will reduce those truck numbers up to 75%. And essentially, the trucks will come into the North Terminal in Fairview Cove, which is the Basin Terminal, which is restricted by the 2 bridges we have in Halifax as far as the size of a ship that goes there. And those containers will go on rail back and forth to the south end. So essentially, we're setting up the south end terminal to be a ship to rail terminal, and that is what will grow the gateway as far as containers that are just coming to go right into Central North America. And the other terminal will be focused on sort of the regional local truck traffic.
We've seen some of your cargo head down into the Midwest, and certainly, some of your bulk cargoes, because you handle a fair amount of bulk cargo as well. Out of there, you get, aggregate out of the Cancel Straits and places like that. And while it's difficult to tell the difference between a Canadian rock and a U.S. rock, I know that a lot of it does wind up eventually moving down, if it's transferred from rail, moving down the river system, on there. And you've also were a good partner with us in Boston. When I was the deputy director down in Boston, we found that the same ship that would call on Halifax would eventually call on Boston, and then, cycle south to places like Norfolk and before they return back to Europe. The ships are getting bigger, and you're one of the few ports that can really handle a deeper draft ship.
Yeah, I mean, that's the unique advantage of Halifax, is that it's one of the largest, if not the largest, ice-free port in the world. We can take up to in excess of 24,000 TEU ships with no restrictions to the south end terminal. We've got a very good program as far as training, refresher training that the Atlantic pilots run through, and we just finished some simulations in the marine simulator in Quebec City actually a few months ago to refine the operations between the pilots and the tugs to get these larger vessels through. We have a number of different channels that we can do that with now. So it's a great advantage, but it also takes a lot of work, a lot of collaborative work, just because of the nature of the regulatory environment in Canada. The ports don't own the Pilotage Authority. They work under the Pilotage Act. They work for the Minister of Transport, much like we work for the Minister of Transport to manage the port. So it's a collaborative effort between the Coast Guard to run as the vessel traffic service, the tugs and the pilots who support that, and then terminal operator.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned the collaborative effort, because in keeping up with the mission and the focus of the International Association of Marine and Port Executives, right? Along with the Inland Rivers Ports and Terminals, one of our main missions is to unify operations, and what's happening in this area that, you know, may be implemented in a different area, you know, increasing our efficiencies, increasing our effectiveness, just learning from others. And so one of the reasons that we wanted to invite you today to talk with us is, what are you doing in Canada that, you know, could potentially be looked at from the US standpoint? I know that you do have some challenges with the 17 ports in Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that you're having?
Sure. So I'll talk about, I guess innovation is a good place to start. I mean, innovation brings efficiencies, and what we've seen since I've been there is that if you're at the forefront of innovation, you can make some decisions on empowering some innovative techniques to be used, then you're going to be a bit farther ahead. But that's not governed by sort of any formal regulatory construct as yet. There's been a major review of Canadian ports under the Port Modernization Review that is coming to a close, and there's some recommendations and some legislation that's going through, and innovation is part of that. But I would say that a number of ports are ahead of the government on innovation. So what we did in Halifax is we started up what's called a living lab called the PEER, and that's an acronym that stands for Port Innovation, Engagement, and Research. And essentially what we do in there is we have almost 50 companies that work in there in and around the transportation, logistics, and supply chain sectors, and they solve problems, and they help us solve problems. Maybe not specifically for the Port of Halifax, but they solve problems for the supply chain that if useful, their companies will do well, and they'll also be able to help the government in making some of these decisions maybe a bit earlier on changing regulations to meet those technological advances that can help with the supply chain. So on the innovation side, I think we're doing a lot. There's a number of different constructs out there. Montreal has a very different construct and the innovation center that they manage, and Vancouver has a different construct as well. But I think innovation is the key, and if the government isn't going to push you hard enough to do it, you kind of have to get out there ahead of your ski tip sometimes and do those things so that you can see some value for what you're doing.
I love that. And so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has told us recently that they're emphasizing or putting more emphasis on their research and development and using more innovative approaches and techniques. And I think it's kind of what you're speaking of, but you're doing it more on the private side, whereas the Corps is doing it, you know, on the public side. Am I capturing that correctly?
Yeah, I would love to have a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They seem to be able to solve a lot of problems in the U.S., which is great. But I think yeah, you're right. So you know, our model is essentially we have some large corporate sponsors that are helping us move this ahead. Other models are the government provides a lot of funding to sort of help these things. So the government hasn't provided funding for this. We're doing this on our own. We don't really have an extensive borrowing limit as you would think. And so because of capital projects and you know, increasing in operational expenditures for things like supporting IT and cybersecurity issues, things get pretty expensive. Mm-hmm. And so this kind of has to stand on its own. And the return on investment isn't necessarily going to be a monetary return on investment. The return on investment you're going to get is hopefully the living lab breaks even, But if it makes money, you get to re-roll that money into future projects.
It's a little bit different system, and I have to say it's a great facility. We just did the training program for your senior personnel, and we had personnel from other ports as well in Canada who came to the MPE program, the international version, right? So the nice thing about that was that I got to see AIMSCIP was there, CN was there, you know, and a lot of your carriers and stuff were all located in this facility. And I personally feel that the private sector can drive innovation better than the public sector can, because the public sector is always being tackled by politics. You know, well, you know, maybe we need some money over here. They always try to spread this out all over the place. So the different areas where you have the private sector there, but coordinated and enhanced through funding, you know, by the public sector, works very effectively, I think. And I think that was very nice. And certainly in talking with your folks, you know, I think people could see, even though there's not necessarily a great return on the amount of money that you might make from it, the fact is that you're bringing a lot of innovation into play is a critical factor, you know. And, you know, I'll use, for example, lobsters. You know, for years, you know, lobsters were moved out of Canada. They're actually Maine lobsters that work their way north and get caught up there.
I like how you did that.
Yeah. They working with Dalhousie University and Marist put together this program where they could export lobsters, you know, in containers, you know, with less loss and everything. So the reality in all of this is that you see that innovation because it's profit oriented, right? And you see that innovation coming out of centers like this. But you also, you know, we're dealing with issues, you know, and of course, I've always pointed out in the course that there's a great synergy between Canada and the United States. I mean, you all do the same thing that we do. We follow the same systems. You know, your rules and regulations and your laws are very similar to ours and stuff like that. And the one big thing that I harp on, certainly in the United States, is, you know, we really need a comprehensive transportation policy, you know, in the United States, which we see more of it in Canada and Mexico. But, you know, has that benefited? Have you seen the practical results of that, the way you do things up there?
Yeah, that's a good comment, because the transportation regulations in Canada aren't bad. The problem is that we don't really have a national supply chain agenda. We don't have a national freight strategy, if you want to call it that. And so because of that, you know, we have the longest coastline in the world for a country. I think we're the third largest country in the world. We only have 37 million people that live in Canada. So the revenues that are generated to run the government are minute in scale compared to our friends to the south and in other countries. And so the problem is there's only so much money to go around. And I think that has caused the system to be far more political, if you want to call it that. And that's just the reality of where it is. So, you know, you wouldn't want to designate, let's say, Halifax as the Atlantic Gateway, where all the money for infrastructure and expansion would go to Halifax, but not to other ports that could benefit from some of that funding. And so I think there's more political reasons than anything else why we haven't changed that. There's a fantastic study that was done 18 months ago through the National Supply Chain Task Force that the government, the Ministry of Transportation, kicked off. It was a number of great forums, great discussions. They put out a report with some fantastic recommendations. And, you know, myself, like everyone else in this industry, is waiting, hopefully, that the government will enact those recommendations, because this goes to exactly what you're saying and what we've been talking about, which is, you know, you have to make some tough decisions in order to find the efficiencies you want for a national supply chain. And if you don't do that, then you're going to be left with what you have now, which is you basically have to fight to get funding to do your job, and we shouldn't be there. So I'm hopeful that we'll get some change in that area.
I was very happy when Aimee informed our listeners about the expansion of the Marine Highway Program, you know, which now involves Canada.
Yeah, so the administration's focus to increase, you know, business and transportation and throughput from and from the US to Canada is interesting. You know, what can we do as US transportation professionals doing business with Canada to increase those opportunities? What do you see in your mind as maybe the biggest need, if you will? What's the big whale? What's the big fish? What could we be doing here in the United States to be a better transportation partner with Canada?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I know, from experience that, the agreement that Canada and the US manage, the sort of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway system is a great model for that. I think it's probably underutilized as far as, if you want to call it, driving commercial opportunities. But I think, when you think about all the inland waterways and the opportunities to move goods and people on the water rather than on a truck or a train, I don't think we take advantage of that.
Right.
And if you look at many other countries, especially in Europe, Australia is another good example, where they just have a common sense approach to it and get over some of the regulations they already have and try to change those regulations. And much like the United States has regulatory constraints against what vessels can come in and out of the coastal regions of the US, and Canada has a similar construct. And so finding easy solutions is easy until you get to that regulatory spot and someone says you can't do that. And so, we've been working with a number, you mentioned Boston. I mean, that was a great example of inshore shipping and a connected routing by the water that made sense and it worked. We sort of got away from that, I think, is in Canada, especially in thinking in those terms, partly because of the regulatory environment. But I think what I can say is, we do need to work together and kind of push those issues so that if we can find those common grounds to change the regulations, that we can do it through a number of, what do you call them, trials or whatever you want to call
Exactly.
it, to see the benefits of that.
Exactly. And a couple of examples come to mind for me, and maybe, this sounds silly or minute, but, even something as simple as, so we have the Jones Act, in the United States, and I'm sure it sounds like you have a similar type of Jones Act in Canada, or maybe it's the weight limits, like on just those semi trucks itself. What if we're at 88,000 pounds per truck and Canada is at, I don't know, 80,000? What are those regulatory pieces that do need to change in order for us to be better trade partners?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I've always, and I know my fellow merchant mariners, I'll be looking under my car with a mirror after I say this, but one of the things that I have been an advocate for, even when I was very active in Boston and here in Portland, was the unification of the cabotage law for Canada and the United States under a single regulatory framework. Whereas the United States would recognize Canadian flag vessels, for their trade, and certainly Canada will recognize US flag vessels in their trade. And I know that CETA is still out there. Nothing's really happened with the Canadian-European Trade Alliance. But one of the big concerns that we've always had is that, well, if the Jones Act goes away and everything like that, we're going to see Chinese flag towboats up, and which I don't think it would ever get to that, But I think certainly the synergies between the US and Canada exist, that extending our trade into Canada, Canadian trade. And I know 37 million people are oftentimes concerned about what goes on. We sneeze down here and sometimes Canada catches a cold, but that should not be an issue. Just like, a number of years ago when Mr. Harper proposed, a unification of the customs. Can we open up the borders a little bit more and do that? And I'm very anxious to see what's going to happen with CSX. Now that CSX has picked up Pan Am Railways, is that going to improve a connection between Halifax, and how's that going to impact the ports on the US East Coast and everything like that? But I think certainly what you've recognized, Aimee, in your world, right? It's never about one mode of transportation.
Right.
It's about the flexibility of transportation. And I think what happens is a lot of our ports get very comfortable, we're focused on one thing. We love containers, we love automobiles, we forget about the fact that a successful port is one that's diverse. And the inland river ports are certainly focused on diversity. You'd love to get into container on barge, but don't hang your hat on just container on barge.
I would love to get into container on barge and utilizing, I feel like, the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway to kind of catapult us into that market would be absolutely phenomenal. I look at the Great Lakes as almost that gateway that we currently have in the Gulf, right? Where, those containers, the container ships and those vessels can come into the Gulf. We can transload into a barge and ship up. And I almost feel like it's the same top-down kind of approach, through the Great Lakes, transload onto a barge and then send it down into the heartland. I would love to get into that. But I do want to ask you about workforce. You really haven't mentioned it as a challenge at this point. What are you seeing in the Canadian workforce market? Is there a challenge, or are you comfortable with the workforce pool that you have?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I'm sure as much as you guys are challenged with the availability of workers, not just workers, but properly trained workers, we're in the same boat, so to speak. So
Unintended.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the past 10 to 15 years in the marine sector in Canada, across the sector and across the country, we've had a shortage of young people who not necessarily aren't interested in the industry. They don't know enough about it. So we started doing something recently. We hired an expert, Dr. Sherry Scully, who works for us as our Director of Workforce Development, and she works out of the Pier, out of the Living Lab. And so what she's trying to do is she's trying to say, okay, so we have a current construct. It's out of date. Some would say it's a bit archaic on how those guys and girls support what's happening in and around the port. What's the gap between what they're doing now and maybe what they could be doing? And then what is the future workforce going to look like when you start talking about some of the technological advances that might take away a job that someone's doing right now, but offer a host of opportunities in either the similar job doing that remotely, or perhaps that job is automated, but other jobs come out of things like automation. And so at least we're having those discussions now in Canada, but you'll see that the ILA workers on the west coast of Canada are striking. They're in a strike position. They're not happy. That there doesn't seem to be any change there between what the employers and the unionized workers are able to come to a compromise. Partly because we're in a new era. And I was talking about this earlier with Jeff. We have some new people who are working at the port who come with new ideas about how the port should be operating and how it should be, looking after the port from a sustainability point of view. And so, when you have longshoremen who are now worried about their work-life balance, well, you have to have those discussions, and you have to be able to come to some compromises and solutions, because younger folks in that world, they want to use their phone to be able to manage where they're working and how they're working. And so there has to be a transition. And so that's one of the things we're doing with our workforce development initiative is trying to close the gap that currently exists, and then trying to come up with some ways, not only to get people aware of the challenges and the jobs and the opportunities that exist on the marine side, but we have a lot of folks regionally and across the country. So our First Nations, our Aboriginal peoples, as well as African Nova Scotians in Nova Scotia, they don't even have the opportunity to get into some of these sectors, because they don't even know that these jobs are available, just because of the way that we've set up our education system. And so, we're looking at all of these things to try to come up with some ideas on how to spread awareness and really try to make a difference, so that when we go to introduce technology, we're not going to be caught off guard. That the institutions have courses ready to go and people are interested in applying for those.
So a deeper synergy certainly between, you have, the Nautical Institute up there,
Right, yeah.
up in Cape Breton and stuff. Recently we had the unfortunate circumstance of seeing two brave firefighters who lost their life on a ship in New York. And I know that the Canadian ports take on much more of the responsibility in regard to security, harbor activities and stuff like that, even firefighting and emergency response and everything like that. And it's not universal in the United States, where some of the ports we did in Boston, we have the Marine Incident Response Team that was put together, and we trained all the firefighters, but it took a pile of money out of our pocket, but well worth it, because one life is well worth, whatever you spend on it and stuff like that. What are some of the things that you do to get your firefighters and your emergency response people, tuned into these changing ship designs?
Yeah, and that really is a complicated problem to solve, because of course, the regulations in Canada aren't clear, as they probably aren't as clear as they should be in the United States, as far as who's responsible for marine safety and security and firefighting. And so a lot of the cities, the municipalities have taken up, the torch to say, well, I'm going to be responsible. I'm going to create, a fire brigade or a marine security force, and then some of the cities have done that. But because there's no consistent approach, and unfortunately, at the federal level, the public safety department really has taken hold of this issue and then resolved it. As you say, ports are left to come up with some ideas on how to tackle that themselves. So, we're lucky in Halifax. We're lucky because we have a big Coast Guard base in Halifax. We have the Navy has the largest base in Halifax, and so with both of those entities come vessels that are capable to react to security, environmental, and firefighting capabilities. And so the sad part is that, and as the example that you gave really shows the criticality of this, the city's fire department are left 9 times out of 10 being the ones that are that are there to respond, but they're not properly trained, and they don't have the proper equipment to go on board a ship and fight a fire. So what we've been doing is we've been working with our firefighters in the city of Halifax, plus the D&D firefighters, and having discussions. We're developing memorandums of understanding on how the D&D firefighting group can train some of the Halifax Fire Department folks to be able to at least, have a general knowledge of the layout of the ship, be able to go on the ship, understand the firefighting systems, to the point that they could safely go on there to help if they needed to. But that's only sort of a very small first step. We're doing things like looking at some vessels we can procure with some firefighting abilities. We're working with the Navy to sort of rethink their purchase of a fire tug, as an example. I saw that the fire tug here in Portland. And the interesting thing is
Which
that
was built in Canada, by the way.
well, that's what I was going to say to you. The interesting is, it was built in Canada, and it's not a very big vessel, but it does what you would need it to do, as far as an on-water presence, when you have whether it's a building that faces the water, or whether there's a ship alongside or an anchor. And so those are the type of things that we have to I guess I would say accelerate. Because there's been too many years of talking about things and not really doing anything. And so we recently added that to our tariffs. And so part of Harbor Dues coming to Halifax is for marine firefighting. And we're gonna take that money and we're gonna put it to use.
I think this is certainly one of the things that would be very universally worked out between the U.S. and Canada. We developed a standard that would cover the inland operations as well as coastal operations, because Canada's a little bit different in regards to utilization of your Department of National Defense. If your Prime Minister wants to send the troops in, he can do so. In the United States, of course, it has to be requested by the governor. But we have a number of firefighting facilities here in the States that are run by the government. Maritime Administration runs them. Texas A&M is probably one of the finest, that you have out there. And if there was a universal standard for training, and it's under CFRs, but it's vague.
Right.
And wouldn't it be wonderful if you had a system in place where you can have a program, because fighting a fire on an inland river is different.
Totally different. And the infrastructure that you impact, right? So if you have a barge and a tow that's, on fire, and you're approaching a lock structure, the damage to a lock and a dam could now totally impact the community to which it serves and protects, right? So absolutely crucial. And I really feel like the IMPE, through its course offerings, with the marine terminal operations, that is focusing on emergency response is a really great catapult into, educating transportation professionals on emergency response. So we're actually doing our very first inland marine terminal operator training in Memphis in September. And I'm so excited about that program, because it's going to be the first introduction into what it takes and what's involved in inland marine terminal operating, including emergency response.
And we're very fortunate. And one of the discussion points at the board meeting will be the development of, is it appropriate for IAMPE, now that we have a universally accepted, a worldwide accepted certification for managers and professionals, to do something in the firefighting realm. I mean, we have some great members on the advisory committee who basically have been training people in shipboard firefighting and ship operations and everything, to be able to offer that to the firefighters. We had the unique experience of taking a group of firefighters out on the Patriot State a number of years ago when we first developed the Marine Incident Response Team. They had all the turnout gear and they had everything on board, and we said, okay, there's a fire up in the forecastle, right? So the first thing they went up there is they wanted to do two things. They wanted to get in there to see if there's anybody need to be rescued, right? And somebody wanted to cut through the steel with their fire axe, right? So you began to realize that there were some great limitations here. And one of the concepts that we talked about was that sometimes you have to sacrifice a life to save a ship, which is very unfamiliar, to average firefighters and stuff like that. And what was nice about it is we took all the trainers out with us. And so the trainers trained the rest of the personnel, because firefighters learn best from other firefighters. And I think in the long run, how it worked out was that we managed to train several thousand folks, in the course of all of this in and around Boston. And it's happened in other locations, but wouldn't it be nice if we had a universal standard where we said, if you're from Halifax, if you're from New York City, if you're from, anywhere on the Great Lakes or anywhere in the inland rivers, come to school, learn about basic structure and everything like that. And then through a program, go into marine firefighting, because marine firefighting, certainly in the firefighting courses that I've been through, they have the SS Never Sail, where you go in there and they light diesel fire underneath you and you got to put it out, so I mean, that's a whole different experience.
And it is so exciting to think of that. Again, I just wanted to thank you for being our inaugural, guest on the Doc Talk podcast. I hope that you consider coming back and joining us, because I have way more questions than what we had time for today, but sincerely, thank you.
I certainly will. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having me. And let us officially welcome you to the Board of Advisors of the International Association of Maritime Port Executives. Nice to have you aboard.
Nice.
Captain Monroe, as always, it's a pleasure. Thank you for joining me today.
Admiral Andrus, it's nice to have you as well.
Thank you.